welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this fourth Sunday after Epiphany, when our gospel lesson is written in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Jesus saw the crowds and went up the mountain. And when he had sat down, his students came forward. He opened his mouth and taught them, saying, "The poor in spirit are favored, since theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Mourners are favored, since they shall be strengthened. The gentle are favored, since they shall inherit the earth. Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are favored, since they shall be satisfied. The merciful are favored, since they shall receive mercy. The pure in heart are favored, since they shall see God. The peacemakers are favored, since they shall be called God's children. Those persecuted on account of righteousness are favored, since theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You are favored when they revile you and persecute you and say every evil against you, lying on my account. Rejoice and celebrate, because your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets before you." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Here are the Beatitudes, the beginning of what we know as the Sermon on the Mount, the first of 5 large speeches that Matthew records as Jesus' principal teachings throughout the gospel. Here in chapters 5 to 7, the Sermon on the Mount, and then also in chapters 10 and 13 and 18 and 24-25. These seem to be large speeches clustering Jesus' teachings that serve to organize Matthew's gospel in a certain way. We know these opening verses of the Sermon on the Mount as the Beatitudes because they speak blessing, which would be known in Latin as the word that stands behind our word beatitude. Here we translate it favored. It's the word that appears in 13 different Psalms, as well as multiple other places within the Old Testament, within biblical Israel's scriptures. Psalms such as 32 and 41, 112 and 119, where ashrei, this word, favored or blessed in the more traditional translation, opens the psalm. Favored are those who ... And Matthew uses the tradition of Jesus' teaching to open his presentation of what Jesus has to say throughout the entire gospel. I talk about this tradition because this is one of the places in the Gospels where you can make a very interesting comparison. Jesus in Matthew, in chapter 5, speaks these 9 Beatitudes. Jesus in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 6, speaks 4 of them, more or less. In Luke's Gospel, what we see are the first, the fourth, the second, and the 9th of Matthew's. Did you catch that? Because the order isn't even the same. But if we number Matthew's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, Luke has Matthew's first about the poor in spirit are favored. Matthew's fourth Those who hunger and thirst for righteousness are favored. Matthew's second, mourners are favored, where Luke talks about those who weep. And then the ninth, the concluding one, you are favored when you suffer persecution on behalf of Jesus and his name. Matthew and Luke seem both to have this tradition about Jesus speaking, teaching about those who are favored. But the two gospel writers expand on that tradition in different ways. Luke expanded on it primarily by adding contrasting woes. Favored are you who are poor, and woe to you who are rich. Favored are you who hunger, and woe to those who are full. Favored are those who weep, and woe to those who laugh. And then the concluding one, favored are you when you are reviled. Matthew expands on this core tradition in two ways. First of all, Matthew has broadened the field. Obviously, Matthew has added additional statements of beatitude, of favor, probably because he had a more expansive tradition, not because he invented them, but because whether in his community or from some other source, he had a larger list of those that Jesus may have spoken. So not only in number, however, but also in terms of their application. When Luke says, blessed are you poor, you can see pretty clearly who's poor and who's not, and he emphasizes that by the woe on the rich. Matthew broadens it by saying, favored are the poor in spirit. Luke talks about favored are the hungry. Matthew expands it. Favored are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They're expanded, and in some ways they have been seen to be perhaps a bit softened, reflecting a different community condition to which Matthew is addressing himself compared with the community that Luke addressed. But then the other way that Matthew expands on this is to take four sayings of favor that describe the circumstances of the favored one and to pair them, in a sense, with four statements of favor about the responses of those who are favored. Let's see how this works. The first four beatitudes for Matthew are, favored are the poor in spirit, favored are those who mourn, favored are the meek, favored are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for those who are oppressed. Those are circumstances in which people find themselves, poor in spirit, mourning, meek, oppressed. The second four that Matthew presents are responses that are available to people. Favored are the merciful. You can choose to have mercy. Favored are the pure in heart. You can choose to keep your own heart pure rather than letting it become corrupted by your circumstances. Favored are the peacemakers. You can work to make peace. And favored are the righteous, those who are persecuted because of their righteousness, those who hold themselves in a right relationship with God. If we look at the four and the four, then we can see a pairing. Favored are the poor in spirit, and favored are the merciful, regardless of how puny or tired or worn out or weary you feel. It is possible for you to show mercy. Favored are those who mourn, regardless of how depressed you are, how sad you are. Don't let that corrupt your heart, because favored are the pure in heart. Favored are the meek, the lowly, the powerless, the ones who feel they have no place in the world. But even if that's the case, you can still work to make peace. Favored are the peacemakers. And favored are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are oppressed. Because if you maintain your righteousness in that, then favored are you who are persecuted for your righteousness. Whatever your circumstances, you can be favored. And in your responses to those circumstances, you can be favored. There's one more thing about the way that Matthew has this structured, and that is to recognize that the first of those 8 that we've been talking about is the poor in spirit are favored, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the 8th one, those persecuted on account of righteousness for Jesus' sake, are favored, since theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This whole picture of favor is bracketed and framed by reference to the kingdom of heaven. And that, Matthew has told us in chapter 4, verse 17, was the whole theme of Jesus' teaching. He appeared in Galilee and he went about proclaiming, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Similarly, at the very end of the gospel, when Jesus has been crucified, a Roman centurion looks on at his death and says, surely this is God's Son. And in that context, the Son of God would be a king of Israel, a king of God's kingdom. Just as in Psalm 2, verse 7, God says to the king, you are my son. Today I have brought you into being. The king of Israel, God's king over God's people, is understood to be God's son. And that reign of God, that kingdom of heaven, is what Matthew focuses on at the very beginning of Jesus' teachings and at the very end of Jesus' life. Here we are at the beginning of Matthew's account of Jesus' ministry, and at the beginning liturgically of this year of Matthew, where we will be hearing many, many gospel lessons from Matthew's story of Jesus. A year in which we will see that for Matthew, Jesus comes to interpret Torah. That will come up very soon in the Sermon on the Mount, to show God's power through healings and miracles, and to open the way for people to live in God's kingdom, under God's rule, whatever one's circumstances. To live with mercy, purity of heart, as a peacemaker, righteous in a right relationship with God. And Jesus says, rejoice and be glad. Your reward is great in heaven. God bless.